Sometimes a historical figure comes along whose impact on the world is impossible to deny, for better or for worse. Such is the case for the person that we'll be talking about today. From her aristocratic upbringing filled with Masonic mysticism and her years of travelling around the world, to the formation of one of the most influential societies in Western esotericism and her own secret doctrine, the influence of which, once you see it, can't be unseen. She's literally everywhere. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the chain-smoking grandmother of the New Age. Helena Blavatsky was born Helena Petrovna von Hahn on the 12th of August 1831. Her father, Colonel Peter von Hahn, was from aristocratic stock, and her mother, Helena Faddeev, was the daughter of Princess Elena Dolgorukaya, who was another Russian noblewoman and part of the House of Dolgorukov. Helena's cousin, Sergei, went on to become the first Prime Minister of the Russian Empire. Which gives you a bit of an idea of how well connected these people are. They're in some high society, powerful crowds. Peter was ordered to serve in what is known as the November Uprising of 1830, and Helena's mother travelled back to the Ukraine to her family, and that is where she gave birth to Helena. Helena was baptised into the Russian Orthodox Church practically as soon as she was born, which was really commonplace at the time. Her mother went on to join Peter, and the family moved around different army camps, and she also had 2 more children and one that died as a baby. This was a really wealthy family. So when I say that they're moving around, like they're traveling with servants, they've got all that kind of stuff. They're very, very, very well looked after people. They lived for a time in Astrakhan, where Helena's grandfather worked with local Tibetan Buddhists, which is where Helena got her first taste of Buddhism, and she'd be taken to a local temple with her mother. Helena's mother was a well-renowned novelist up until her very young death from tuberculosis in 1842, when she was just 28 years old. Helena was 11 at the time, and after her mother's death, they were sent to the city of Saratov to live with their grandmother, Eleanor, they've all got the same names, and her grandfather, who at the time was a civil governor. It's claimed that Helena was very spoiled in her childhood, and she alleged that as a child, she was possessed with a firm belief in the existence of an invisible world of the supermundane and the submundane spirits being inextricably blended with the life of each mortal. Very profound for a child. It's also claimed that Helena was a sickly child, and that the Orthodox nurses that she was surrounded with believed her to be possessed by the devil. Of course they did. She's described as being quite rebellious and strong-willed, prone to ungovernable fits of passion. She was also a natural-born storyteller with a gift for weaving a good narrative, often telling stories to those around her. Her sister described her as the strangest girl one has ever seen. And it's important to note that Helena's childhood and her life in general has been highly mysticised by those that follow her teachings. So take everything with a huge grain of salt. Now, Helena's grandmother is a very interesting character, and according to the book Madame Blavatsky, she taught herself Greek, classical literature, art, botany, and archaeology. This was in a time where women weren't educated, and obviously there's a certain amount of privilege here that Helena's family had versus the general population. They're rich aristocrats, and being rich opened some very big doors. The house that they lived in Saratov is described really vividly in accounts of Helena's life. Obviously her grandfather is the governor, so it's a big old house. It's described as having lots of underground tunnels and a very big library that contained some interesting texts that Helena's grandmother had inherited from her father, Prince Pavel Dolgorukov, who was a Rosicrucian Freemason, and he was allegedly part of the Rite of Strict Observance. But what the hell does that mean? Well, Rosicrucianism came about in the 17th century, and basically a bunch of manifestos were published anonymously that talked about a secret society where they would study esoteric wisdom that was allegedly passed down from ancient times. They fused together a lot of different religious and spiritual thought, from Christianity Christianity to Gnosticism and Jewish mysticism like Kabbalah. Essentially, these people would have to print this stuff anonymously or under pseudonyms, otherwise they would be accused of being a heretic, which is basically going against the church. And we don't have time to go into the history of Freemasonry, but if you don't know what a Freemason is, essentially it's a male-only fraternity which grew in popularity in the 18th century. And a few scholars actually believe that Freemasonry was like an outgrowth of Rosicrucianism. Interestingly, the rite of strict observance, which Elena's grandfather is alleged to have been part of, was formed by a man named Baron von Hund, who said that he had been initiated into a mysterious Masonic order of the Temple in Paris in 1742, and that his secret knowledge had been gained from unknown superiors. Also, this was the same time that the Illuminati were operating, and I know some of you might be like, what? The Illuminati? And yes, but not the crazy David Icke InfoWars style Illuminati. This was a secret society that was formed in Bavaria. They're called the Bavarian Illuminati. And all of these groups sprung out of what is widely known as the Age of Enlightenment that was going on at the time, which was essentially a very broad movement of people that were advocating for a move away from feudalism and the monarchy and towards a society that was more focused on like the individual, science, and being a bit more rational, but it also combined elements of mysticism. Anyway, all of that is to say that Elena's family were super connected to these secret societies that were also really interested in occultism and all of that kind of stuff. Elena's grandfather's library was full of texts on alchemy and the occult, and in the book Madame Blavatsky, Gary Lachman says that it is possible that Elena's grandfather met a man named Comte de Saint-Germain, who was a philosopher and a bit of a con man, and you might remember that name from my video on Love Has Won. And he is going to be a name that pops up again and again in some upcoming videos too. He was known as the Wonder Man, and the story of his life is very obscured, and some say that that was deliberate. There are fantastical stories about this guy, like he's been accused of being a spy in England, he's a Freemason, he was apparently an amazing musician, he was a ladies' man, talk your head off kind of guy that died in 1784. Elena said that Saint Germain had given her grandfather a manuscript that had predicted in every detail the thorough metamorphosis of nearly the whole of the European map, beginning with the French Revolution. So he's basically a mystic as well, like a bit of a time traveller. He knows what's going on. He can see the future. What a guy to know. Elena's access to her grandfather's library was the perfect storm for a rebellious child that was looking for adventure and something different. She was searching for truth and answers to questions about the universe, and a lot of these secret societies at the time were railing against the norms of the day. They were fusing together spirituality, science, and they were also striving for political change. And Elena relates to that. She wants change. She began to retreat away from this world that she lived in, which was very high society aristocracy, and she immersed herself in the world of the esoteric. It's in this time that she claims to have experienced things like astral projection, and she also claims to have had visions of a mysterious Indian man. More on that later. The family moved from Saratov as her grandfather finds a new job as the director of the state lands in the South Caucasus, which consists of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And it's here that she befriends Prince Alexander Golitsyn, who was into all of the same things that she was. He was also a Freemason. He's a bit of a traveller. He'd been all over. He'd been to like Greece, Egypt, Iran, India. And he is the person who's credited with telling Elena to travel and pursue her interest in the esoteric. But this rebellious child needed little encouragement.
Go into the chapel and we're gonna get married.
When she was 17, she married Nikifor Blavatsky, who was much older than her, like in his 40s old, and he was vice governor of the province of Erevan. There are numerous accounts about why they actually got married. She claimed that he had some sort of like magical beliefs, but others claim that the family arranged the marriage because she was secretly plotting to run away with Prince Alexander. She did end up saying in a letter, "Do you know why I married old Blavatsky? Because whereas all of the young men laughed at my magical superstitions, he believed in them. She also goes on to say that the marriage was never consummated and that she has never been anyone's wife. Indeed, she maintained that she was celibate up until her death. She's incredibly dedicated to her spiritual work and she just doesn't have the time or the interest in anything else. She was married on July 7th, 1849, and alleges that when the priest said that she will honour and obey her husband, she said, "I will surely not." Helena Blavatsky, the original girl boss. Long story short, she kept her word because she ditched him after about 3 months of trying to get rid of him and not really succeeding. Her family were not very happy about this, so they decided to try and ship her off to St. Petersburg, which was where her father was based at the time. But Helena obviously was like, absolutely not. I'm going to do what I want. And her and a servant and a maid made their way to Kerch, where she ditched them, and then she made her way to Constantinople alone, which is now known as Istanbul. Now, this is where I'm going to try and condense 25 years of Helena's life that is chock full of myths and unfounded information into something that is concise and easy to understand. And I also think that it's important to remember Saint Germain's story here. He is another aristocratic adventurer whose life has taken on this mythological story. We don't know how much of this is true. We're really relying on biased sources here. So apparently in Constantinople, she was walking home and she happened upon the nearly deceased body of a man named Agadi Metrovich, and he'd been stabbed by a group of ruffians who were allegedly in service to the Jesuits, so in service to the Catholic Church, basically. He was a bit of a political revolutionary, and this obviously was a time where religion was still the order of the day. He was part of a secret society himself called the Carbonari, which were against religion being in control, abbreviated version. And they themselves have been alleged to have been an offshoot group from Freemasons. There is so much interwoven in all of these groups. I feel like I need a corkboard and string and all of that kind of stuff. And I hope that you're keeping up because there is a Q&A at the end and you better get the questions right. After Constantinople, Helena went to Greece and then Cairo, where she met a man named Albert Rawson, who, like her, was a bit of a traveller. And it was there that both of them met another man named Paulos Metamon, who many claim was one of Helena's original masters, and we'll get on to those later. After Cairo, she went to Paris, where she got in with some spiritualists. Now, at the time, spiritualism was kicking off, and it is basically the belief in being able to contact the dead. Think like Victorian seances and the rise of clairvoyance and mediums. And it's in this time that she would claim to go into trances, and it's alleged that when she was in the trances, she'd act like a completely different person. Then she went to England, where she claimed to have met the mysterious Indian man that she had had visions of as a child in the flesh, the master of her dreams. She called him Master Moya, and he was allegedly in a crowd of people when she saw him, and she was like, oh my god, it's the man from my childhood. Now, as with almost anything related to Helena Blavatsky, there are multiple different stories. Some people say he was part of like a Nepalese embassy in London. Others say that she was about to jump off of a bridge, Waterloo Bridge in London, and he came up and stopped her. And there's also another account of her meeting him in Ramsgate. I don't know if anyone knows where Ramsgate is. Just a weird place for all of this to happen. The only evidence of Moya ever existing comes from those connected to Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, which she went on to found, which we will get onto. That's to say that the evidence is sketchy. Like, to believe it, you have to believe certain people's accounts of his existence and that the correspondence they purport to be from him isn't faked. Essentially, you've got to have faith. According to Helena, the masters were essentially watching over her as a child. It's like this idea that she's important to them. They're deliberately seeking her out. And Moya gives her a mission, which is to go to Tibet, where she'll be able to master her spiritual power that was developing at the time. See, Moya was part of a group that Blavatsky and others would later call the Masters of the Ancient Wisdom, or the Masters of the Hidden Brotherhood, sometimes called the Great White Brotherhood, sometimes called Adepts or Mahatmas. And these were essentially a group of enlightened individuals that had high spiritual wisdom. Some that have studied Blavatsky believe believe that these masters didn't actually exist in like the form that many people say they did, and that they were actually just based on some interesting people that she met upon her travels. Like, remember, she's a very good storyteller, so there's a definite possibility that she's just spinning a good yarn. And also remember that her formative years were spent looking at her grandfather's library, and that he was part of this rite of strict observance, which spoke about this idea of unknown superiors. But before heading to Tibet, she went to the US and she travelled down through Central America, and she ended up going to India in 1852, where she stayed for a little while. During this time, she also claimed to receive letters from Master Moya, given her spiritual guidance and instructions on her mission. They're kind of like 19th century esoteric pen pals. She tries to get into Tibet, which was an incredibly difficult task given its remote location and the fact that entry into Tibet was heavily guarded. So instead, she gets on a boat to England, which crashes en route because of course it does, and she does survive. Allegedly, when she was in England, she was part of the Philharmonic Orchestra. She's like this proper jack of all trades kind of gal, and her life is so remarkably similar in all of these strange details to Saint Germain, which is the one thing that really struck me when I was researching her. Their lives are very similar. After England, she goes back to the US for a while before making her way back to India, where she claims to be under the instruction of certain men endowed with such mysterious powers and such profound knowledge that we may truly designate them as the sages of the Orient. So she tries to get into Tibet again, massive fail, and she ends up reuniting with her family in Russia, and they notice some changes in her. They say that she'd developed some strange powers, and that there would be like random rapping noises in the house and on the windows, and that furniture would move of its own accord. Helena admitted that she was the one causing it, but that it was happening unintentionally. She just had no control. It's alleged that she convinced her skeptic brother of her powers when she made a chess table impossible for him to lift. Essentially, he lifted it first, he could do it easily, and then she focused on it and he couldn't lift it at all. And when she stopped focusing on it, he could lift it again, but because he was straining so bloody hard, he ended up injuring himself. I think he like fell back. Numerous other strange things happened around her, and it was kind of like this mythology of her life was building. People were starting to think that she was something a little bit more extraordinary than the average Joe. And obviously it helped that she had been on all of these wild travels and had been communicating with these so-called masters. And she's a bloody aristocrat as well. She meets another master named Aryan, and again, this is a man with a mythical story, but some researchers, like Kenneth Paul Johnson, who has written several books on Blavatsky, think that he was most likely someone that Helena had met and then like mysticized in her later writings. She met him while she was travelling to Tiflis, which is where her grandmother was living at the time. While she's in Tiflis, she reconnects with Metrovich, remember the guy who'd been stabbed by the Jesuits? This is why we need a corkboard. And she also had a brief reconciliation with her husband, Blavatsky. In this time, she also agreed to adopt her sister's illegitimate child, who was called Yuri, and some people claim that Yuri was the love child of Helena and Metrovich, but there isn't really any proof of that. Yuri died when he was 5 years old, and he was buried under Metrovich's name, which lends credence to the theory, but there's no real proof. Helena also falls off a horse, and she goes into a coma for a fractured spine, and this was allegedly a transformative experience for her. Like, she came out fully recovered, and she's a changed woman. And during her recovery, she said that she was in this dream where she was traveling in a totally new and unfamiliar country, and that she had no recollection of who Helena Blavatsky was. So she starts traveling again, and the timeline is sketchy as hell, but she is alleged to have studied Christian Kabbalah at some point, and also to have fought at the Battle of Mentana, which happened on November 3rd, 1867. And it was there that she is alleged to have been gravely injured and left for dead. She's just like, she's getting blown up, she's going from XYZ, she's in battles, all of this stuff is happening to her. But it wasn't until 1868, when she was in Florence, that she was allegedly contacted again by Master Moya, who told her to meet him in Constantinople. And from there, they travelled together deep into the Himalayan mountains and finally into Tibet. Whether or not Helena Blavatsky made it into Tibet is a highly contested matter. Like I said earlier, it was near impossible for people to actually gain entry, although some say that if she was really travelling with this Master Moya character, it might have been easier for her. But again, we don't even know if Moya actually existed. However, later down the line, there were stories about how people had seen a white woman travelling in 1867 and 1868, but again, it's unverifiable. It could just be people being like, yeah, I just saw this white woman knocking around. Like she was just walking around the mountains. Helena claims to have spent 7 years in Tibet at a school run by another master named Kuthumi. Here, she claims to have learned how to develop her psychic powers, along with learning an ancient unknown language called Senzar. She claims that Senzar is the mystic name for the secret sacerdotal language, the mystery speech of the initiated adepts all over the world. She is the first and only record of this language, so does it exist? Well, the jury is out, but probably not, although it has been claimed by some that she was actually referring to an ancient form of Sanskrit. She claimed that Senzar was the language used to record what she called the stanzas of Xion, also known as the Book of Xion, and we'll get onto that later when we talk about one of her most famous and most controversial books, which was The Secret Doctrine. So while she's in Tibet, she's doing all kinds of mad stuff with the masters. They're doing telepathy training, astral projection, mind reading. She's basically 11 out of Stranger Things. It was also claimed that her aunt Nadja received a letter from Master Kuthumi claiming that Helena was safe and well and would be returning home soon. According to Nadja, the letter was delivered by a strange man who disappeared in front of her when he delivered her the letter. Again, there's zero proof, and these people could just be trying to add to this legend that Helena was creating for herself. The masters in Tibet set Helena a mission. She was to go and prove that the spiritualists in America were not a fraud. But there was a caveat. See, what Blavatsky said that they were actually contacting were the shells of the dead, and then the mediums would put their own thoughts and their own kind of life force onto these shells. These shells were not ghosts as we know it. Helena believed that humans inhabited a physical body for a certain amount of time before moving on. So it's a general belief in reincarnation, but it was also this idea that humanity ascends in wisdom. And you see this idea of ascension in, again, almost every religion, like the ascension of Jesus. You see it in a lot of people that talk about ascending to 5D. After Blavatsky's passing, the masters became known as the ascended masters, and that is how they're more commonly referred to now in New Age circles. Although Helena herself never referred to them as ascended masters, she was very adamant that these masters inhabited human bodies just like the rest of us, but that some of them had found a way to prolong their lives. And in the book Madame Blavatsky, Gary Lachman writes that her mission was, in fact, to revive and revitalise the ancient Hermetic Neoplatonic tradition in which the divine spark sunk into creation longs to return to its source, and which came to be known in our time as occultism. After Tibet, she begins travelling again. She heads to Cairo, but the boat she was on blows up. Only 16 people out of 400 survive, and of course she's one of them. Then she's in Greece, where she gambles on roulette and she wins enough money to finally make it to Cairo. And while she's there, she meets up with Paulos Metamon again. Remember, she'd met him on her trip years before. She was also alleged to have met a guy called Max Theon there, who was the founder of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which is another occultic organisation. Later on, Blavatsky references the Brotherhood of Luxor, which Theosophists say is a totally different thing and was a group which included some of the masters. But again, the timing of this really does lend itself to ask the question, was Helena Blavatsky just hearing things around her and ripping them off? Max Theon is an interesting character as well. He created what's known as the Cosmic Movement with his wife, and the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor has been linked to people like cash gal Beverly Randolph, who was into magic and was an influence on the creation of another occultic group called Ordo Templi Orientis, of which famously Aleister Crowley was a member. And that's just to show the interwoven nature of all of these groups. We could go into 1,000 different tangents, but then this video would be like 8 hours long and nobody would watch it. It's also why we need a fucking corkboard. In Cairo, she formed a society based on what is known as Spiritism, not spiritualism. Spiritism is essentially the belief that we are all immortal spirits that temporarily inhabit a human body. She was staying at a hotel and she met a woman named Emma Cuttin, who was allegedly kind to Elena and lent her money. And Elena formed this society with Metamon and Emma, but it was short-lived. Emma claimed to be a medium. They were all doing like mediumship. And the story goes that Blavatsky was travelling. She comes back to find that those in the society had been doing fake seances and tricking people. So it existed for like 2 weeks. And then she was like, absolutely not in my name, shut it down. She finally arrived in New York on the 8th of July 1873 under instruction from Master Moya. By this time, the money seemed to have dried up a bit. She lived in a housing co-op with other women on the Lower East Side, and she made money by doing things like sewing, leatherwork, and she also designed advertising cards. And in this time, she was also flexing her psychic abilities, and that led to her being interviewed by a journalist called Anna Ballard, who had heard of these abilities through a friend. And Anna Ballard's piece on Elena is the first in-print mention of Elena's time in Tibet. Now, as we mentioned earlier, spiritualism and spiritual phenomena are all over the papers at the time, and Elena was closely following the strange story of William and Horatio Eddy, who were two brothers and alleged mediums who would gather audiences at their home in Chittenden, Vermont to watch them hold seances, basically. Another person who had been tracking this story was Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, who was writing for a newspaper called the Daily Graphic. Henry had been a farmer, he'd written quite a few books on farming, and he had actually become the first ever agricultural editor for the New York Tribune. He also fought in the Civil War, got malaria, so then he became a war correspondent, and he became like very well connected. And he was actually one of 3 people that were assigned to investigate Abraham Lincoln's assassination, as well as like other matters of corruption and conspiracy. He was also a lawyer, but he had a keen interest in spiritualism, and reading about him, he comes across as a bit of a seeker, but he's got all of these strange connections. Blavatsky meets him in 1874 at the Eddy residence, and she kind of wows him with her psychic abilities, and he ends up writing about her, and they also become BFFs. They're like best buds. She calls him Maloney, he calls her Jack, and she tells him about the mission that the masters have given her. Now, in this time, Elena ends up randomly marrying this guy called Michael C. Batanley, who apparently had read about her in the paper and had gotten a little bit obsessed. And the story goes that he had threatened to kill himself if she didn't marry him. So she agreed under the condition that she was to remain celibate. And obviously to get her to marry him, he was like, oh yeah, absolutely. And then as soon as they got married, he tried it on. And she was like, absolutely not. So she left him. It was in this time that spiritualism was starting to be thought of as a bit of a fraud. Like people were getting a little bit skeptical. Some people were coming forward and like debunking a lot of these paranormal claims. And some people were just straight up admitting to making shit up. So Henry and Elena decided to go in their own direction.
You can go your own way.
In 1875, Henry published a book called People from the Other World, which was essentially a collection of the articles that he had written on spiritualism. And he wrote that this very American outbreak of spiritualistic phenomena is under the control of an order, which, while depending for its results upon unseen agents, has its existence upon earth among men. He was obviously hinting towards Elena's masters here, and he and Blavatsky decided to write a letter to the editor of the Spiritual Scientist, talking about how they were moving away from spiritualism. When they rearranged the paragraphs in the letter, they saw that the first letter of each of the 6 paragraphs spelled out Tutit, which was another of Elena's masters, Tutit Bey. After this, Henry starts to get his own letters from the masters that talk about the next steps, and these letters are supposedly signed from the Brotherhood of Luxor. The letters also talk about very practical things like Elena Elena's marriage, and you'd wonder why a master of such great wisdom would be concerned with Elena's marriage. I'll leave you to decipher that one. Henry and Helena form a group that they call the Mystery Club, where they hold lectures. And it was through this group that they met a man named William Quan Judge, who was an Irish mystic. During a lecture by a man named George Felt on the topic of whether the ancient pyramids were created through advanced occult knowledge, on the 7th of September 1975, Henry Olcott, William Judge, Helena Blavatsky, and around 16 others decided to form a society dedicated to researching and studying the occult, and thus Theosophy was born. Blending the words theos, meaning God, and Sophia, meaning wisdom, Theosophy had its first official meeting later that year on November 17th. At the time, science was overriding religion, and as much as the Theosophists hated the power that religion had, they also disliked the lack of spirituality within science. So the aim of Theosophy was to blend science and enlightenment ideas with spirituality and the occult. But as much as they claimed to value objectivity and rationality, they were definitely true believers in all things esoteric, strange and occult. But their motto was, there is no religion higher than the truth. And their mission was as follows. Number 1, to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste or colour. 2, the study of ancient and modern religions, philosophies and sciences, and the demonstration of the importance of such study. And 3, the investigation of the unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. Helena also said that any person of average intellectual capacities and a leaning towards the metaphysical, of pure unselfish life, who finds more joy in helping his neighbour than in receiving help himself, one who is ever ready to sacrifice his own pleasures for the sake of other people, and who loves truth, goodness and wisdom for their own sake, not for the benefit they may confer, is a theosophist.
I married Isis on the 5th day of May, but I could not hold on.
After Theosophy's founding, Helena began working on a book that pieced together her ideas, and she ended up writing quite a few, but the main ones were Isis Unveiled in 1877 and The Secret Doctrine in 1888. In Isis Unveiled, she's essentially bringing together all of these different ideas and religious and spiritual thought. Now, it's fucking long. It's not as long as The Secret Doctrine, but they're both written in a way that is like hella dry and very impenetrable. But essentially, she's putting forward her manifesto, telling people that there is one main overarching wisdom religion. So like every single religion is born out of this ancient wisdom. And it's this wisdom religion which is the only possible key to the absolute in science and theology. Her words, not mine. She didn't create this idea though, and like with most of Helena's work, she basically just picks and chooses bits of religion and spirituality, blends it with her own storytelling skills. She's just going around going, I'll have a bit of that, I'll have a bit of that, I'll have a bit of that. She claims that the Book of Xion is the account of this one true ancient wisdom. And she was also a proponent of the idea that ancient civilizations were a lot more technologically advanced than we think they are. And that is an idea that can be found everywhere in modern New Age circles and conspiracy circles. But arguably, she was one of the first to bring all of these ideas together. In Isis Unveiled, she quotes from a ton of different sources, but apparently she wasn't a big book owning gal. So where did she get all of those quotes from? Well, obviously her claim is that she essentially channeled all of this information. But the most rational answer is potentially her mates at the old Theosophical Society were helping her out. The idea that she was channeling information or receiving it telepathically is a lot more interesting, and it adds to her mystique versus Henry Steele Olcott going down and fucking nicking a bunch of books and giving her the quotes, her quoting them without credit. There have been huge allegations over the years of plagiarism, and I think it was probably convenient for Helena to be like, oh, I didn't know the information. It was just flowing through me. I don't even own books. In a letter to her sister, she claimed that the goddess Isis was helping to write the book, saying that, well, Vera, whether you believe me or not, something miraculous is happening to me. You cannot imagine in what a charmed world of pictures and visions I live in. I am writing Isis. Not writing, rather copying out and drawing that which she personally shows me. Also interesting to note here that a man named William Emmett Coleman claimed that he had found 2,000 passages copied from other books without credit in Isis Unveiled. Now, admittedly, he bloody hated Helena, so he might be a little bit biased, but his takedown of Isis Unveiled and later The Secret Doctrine is worth mentioning. Despite having a bit of a personal vendetta against her, he does put forward a very compelling argument of where Helena is getting her information from. Also in Isis Unveiled, she spoke about what she called the Akasha, or the astral light, describing it as an unmutilated record of all that was, that is, or ever will be. The minutest acts of our lives are imprinted on it, and even our thoughts rest photographed on its eternal tablets. It is, in short, the memory of God. And this was basically the first iteration of what would later become known as the Akashic Records. Again, Helena doesn't call it the Akashic Records, and that's something that developed after her death. With so much of this, Helena appears to be one of the first to mention these things that go on to have a huge impact in New Age circles, hence why she earned the title of Grandmother of the New Age. And finally, one of the most interesting parts of Isis Unveiled is her response to Darwin's theory of evolution. She essentially says, yeah, he's not wrong, but he's missed this huge bit out, namely that evolution isn't something that happened by chance. It's not a big bang. Human beings, like plant matter or animals, are the material vessels that the spirit uses temporarily. Yes, that material may evolve over time, but Darwin doesn't address the evolution of the spirit, our consciousness, and she would later expand on this in The Secret Doctrine. During the writing of Isis Unveiled, Helena and Henry were living in an apartment that they called the Lamasery, which is the name that is used for Buddhist monasteries. It was very kitsch, probably looked a little bit like this room. The decor was apparently out of this world, taxidermy the lot. After the book was published and just after Helena had been given her US citizenship, the two of them decided to move to India. Now, Henry was allegedly hesitant to make the move, but he claims he was visited by a master that told him that he had work to do for the good of mankind. He also claims that the master gave him the turban that he was wearing as proof of his visit, and those that study Theosophy claim that this could have been Master Moya. He actually managed to go to India as a US trade representative, and he was recommended by Rutherford Hayes, who was the 19th president of the USA. These connections are fucking wild. Henry had actually been building a relationship with a member of the Arya Samaj, which was part of the Hindu reform movement that was going on at the time. And briefly, the Hindu reform movement was basically trying to get the population to turn away from what they were calling idol worship and towards the acceptance of one god versus multiple deities. And Theosophy was enticing because they also were railing against Christianity. And at the time, India was rife with white Christian missionaries trying to push their beliefs on everyone. But compared to Theosophists, the Arya Samaj were pretty fundamentalist in their beliefs, and their relationship with Theosophy was short-lived. Helena was actually monitored by British intelligence. Like, don't forget, the British Empire is still very much in charge here in these times, and they were concerned that she might be a Russian spy. Theosophy was hella popular in India, and at the height of its popularity, they had over 100 branches there. Like, people were really into Theosophy. And in India, they got up to all sorts. Helena claimed that the masters told her and Henry to visit the Kala caves, which are ancient Buddhist caves, and it was here that she claimed that there were underground tunnels in which the masters would meet. And it's also alleged that she disappeared while they were there, and then she reappeared later, and she was just like, oh, sorry, I was just meeting with the masters. Her and Henry also created a magazine called The Theosophist, and it's around this time that the editor of a newspaper called The Pioneer Alfred Percy Sinnett gets in touch with them, and he invites them to his home in Allahabad, where they stayed for 6 weeks, according to him. A.P. Sinnett was British and he was part of the upper classes, but he was really interested in Elena's ideas, and he soon joined the Theosophical Society. Henry and Helena converted to Buddhism on a trip to Ceylon, which isn't very surprising because the beliefs of Theosophy are very closely aligned with Buddhism, and obviously it had been a huge part of Elena's life from early childhood up until now. Now, Elena's old mate from Cairo, Emma, you remember the one, she'd apparently lent Helena money, and there was the society that didn't pan out because they were doing the fake seances. You remember, I know you remember. Well, she got back in contact with Helena and she told her that her and her husband were really struggling financially. So Helena invited them out to stay at her home in Bombay. Now, there were 2 Theosophists that were already living there, Rosa Bates and Edward Wimbridge, and they didn't get on with Emma or her husband. Rosa actually accused Emma of trying to poison her, and she wanted Helena to kick him out. I think there might have been a little bit of resentment going on there as well, like you've got 2 new people coming in and maybe feeling a little bit displaced, that kind of thing. But Helena refused to kick Emma and her husband out. So Rosa and Edward were like, fuck this, we're going back to America. And I mean, if I'm being poisoned, I ain't sticking around either. Elena's all right though, because she's got her new mates, A.P. Sinnett and his wife, and they're having a bloody grand old time just hanging out with each other. One day they went out for a picnic and everything was accounted for. They had just the right number of cups and saucers. They weren't accounting for one more person to join them. So when somebody did join them, they were like, oh my God, we don't have a cup or a saucer for him. So somebody naturally asks Helena, can't you just make one appear? And apparently she started looking at the ground for a while. She picks out a spot and then she's like, dig that up. And surprise, surprise, there it was, cup and saucer. Again, lots of mixed opinions. She could have planted it. Everyone could be lying. Who knows? But there were other weird things that happened, like the time that Helena allegedly made the brooch of someone's deceased mother appear magically. It's just strange little tales like that that kept popping up all over the place.
Give me a ticket for an aeroplane. Ain't got time to take a fast train.
So A.P. Sinnett claimed to have been visited by Master Koot Humi, who had appeared to him in his astral form. But that wasn't all. Koot Humi said that he'd provide A.P. Sinnett with proof of his visit. And sure enough, Helena randomly asks him where he would like to receive said proof. It was to be something that Koot Humi had taken from his visit. So A.P. Sinnett chooses a pillow belonging to his wife. She bloody loves this pillow. She never lets it out of her sight. So there's little chance of anyone being able to go in beforehand and like plant stuff. But when they cut it open, inside they find a brooch that had been on the dresser in their room with the initials KH scratched into it and a note which read, "My dear brother, this brooch number 2 is placed in this very strange place simply to show you how very easily real phenomenon is produced." Now, what are the bloody chances of this actually happening in real life? I know that I'm going to get comments like, Emily, you're such a bloody skeptic. How do you know you weren't there? And to that I say, you're asking me to believe that not only do these masters exist, but that they're travelling on an astral plane, visiting people, stealing brooches, and then magically making them appear again. I'm not buying it, but A.P. Sinnett was, and he ended up communicating with Koot Humi and occasionally Moya in what would later become known as the Mahatma letters. He actually ended up collecting the ideas expressed in these letters into a book called Esoteric Buddhism, which was published in 1883. And this book was the first in Theosophy to talk about the concept of root races. Now, strap in, folks. Consider this your trigger warning, because this is where this entire thing takes a very dark turn. Arguably, one of the first mentions of the concept of root races comes from a 19th century hoax called the Linda book, which is essentially harmful pseudo-history that purports to describe the origins of races, as well as claiming that white people's ancestral homeland is Atland. This book would later become known as Himmler's Bible. Yes, that Himmler. Root races is by far Blavatsky's most controversial, disturbing and harmful contribution to the world. Although A.P. Sinnett was the first to mention it in print, she went on to expound on it in her book The Secret Doctrine, and she essentially laid out her theories. Like I said before, this is a time where Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is taking hold, and Blavatsky saw this as just one small part of a larger cycle. And she said that Darwin begins his evolution of the species at the lowest point and traces upwards. His only mistake may be that he applies his system at the wrong end. Now, this is a very, very abridged version of The Secret Doctrine, and I'm not an expert. Don't count me as an expert. And this is allegedly a channeled work. She claims to have had access to the Book of Gion. That's where all of this information comes from. According to Blavatsky, there are 7 planetary chains, and within each planetary chain, there are 7 globes that are under the supervision of the Chohan, who are essentially Theosophy's angels. Only one of the globes is physical. That's the 4th globe, and that's the earth in which we inhabit. Now, Theosophy's evolution, if you will, starts on the 1st globe, which is the highest in evolution, and it descends to the 4th globe, which is us, and then it ascends again to the 7th, which is the highest, and it does this 7 times, goes round 7 times. So we begin as pure spirit, then we enter physical matter, and then we become spirit again. And within the globes, there are 7 root races, and bear in mind that all of this takes place over millions of years. The first race are the Pelarians, largely thought of to be jelly-like beings. Then there's the Hyperboreans, believed to have lived in Hyperborea, which is borrowed from Greek mythology. Then there's the Lemurians, who are alleged to have lived on a hypothetical and much debunked continent of Lemuria, which was a theory that was put forward by a zoologist who hypothesized that because he'd found fossils of lemurs in Madagascar and India, but not Africa or the Middle East, there must have been a larger continent that had just been lost. And Theosophists also believed that Australia was a part of Lemuria and that the Lemurian people existed with dinosaurs. After Lemurians came the Atlanteans that existed on the continent of Atlantis, which was originally thought of as an island or a city thanks to Plato, but Helena was like, no, it's the continent, and she claimed that it was made up of parts of Lemuria. And then there's the 5th race, which is allegedly where we are now, and she called this the Aryan race. Now, Blavatsky herself wrote that mankind is obviously divided into God-informed men and lower human creatures. The intellectual difference between the Aryan and other civilized nations and such savages as the South Sea Islanders is inexplicable on any other grounds. No amount of culture nor generations of training amid civilization could raise such human specimens as the Bushmen, the Vedas of Ceylon, and some African tribes to the same intellectual level as the Aryans, the Semites, and the Turanians, so-called. The sacred spark is missing in them, and it is they who are the only inferior races on the globe, now happily, owing to the wise adjustment of nature, whichever works in that direction, fast dying out. Now, to be clear here, the word Aryan was completely co-opted by Hitler and the Nazis, and the Aryans were never white, blonde, blue-eyed Germans until he got a hold of it. But despite what Theosophists will say about Blavatsky's teachings, there are many passages, like the one I just previously read, that point to her belief in certain races being superior to others. She was essentially promoting the idea of an Aryan empire, which relied on races being viewed as inferior and not as spiritually developed as these Aryans. Now, a little bit of a primer on Aryan. You might notice that I'm not saying Aryan, because there is a history behind the word Aryan. And as with everything to do with Nazi Germany and Helena Blavatsky, it's people just pick and choosing shit and then completely co-opting it. The earliest known Aryans lived in prehistoric Iran, and Aryas is a Sanskrit word that was used as a term to differentiate between people that spoke Vedic Sanskrit from those that didn't. And in 1786, William Jones argued that there was a link between European languages and Sanskrit, and this essentially became known as the Proto-Indo-European language family. This theory has inspired all manner of heinous and awful shit, including the myth of an Aryan invasion and supremacy. This is a great video that explains it really simply, and I would highly recommend going to watch it. It is only 5 minutes long. Anyway, all of that is to say that Blavatsky didn't create the word, and she didn't create the racist theories that were going around at the time, but she was very much a product of her time. The links between Blavatsky's writing, Theosophy, and the Nazis has been well documented, and Helena herself has never shied away from being anti-Semitic. She was even linked to Juliana Glinka, who has alleged to have been involved in the dissemination of a pamphlet that I'm not going to name on this channel, but it is essentially the blueprint to almost every anti-Semitic right-wing conspiracy theory. Theosophy itself spawned Ariosophy, which means wisdom of the Aryans, and both Theosophy and Ariosophy were part of the occult revival in Germany. However, Nicholas Goodrick Clark says that Ariosophy is a symptom rather than an influence in the way that it anticipated Nazism. In his thesis on occultism and fascism, Peter Staudenmeier wrote that while ISIS Unveiled made affirmative references to Judaism, the secret doctrine drew a pointed contrast between Aryan spirituality and Jewish materialism, characterizing the Jews as an unspiritual people who have falsified and mangled their own scriptures and systematically degraded the traditions they borrowed from other peoples. Judaism is a religion of hate and malice toward everyone and everything outside of itself. The national features of this stiff-necked race included the idiosyncratic defects that characterize many of the Jews to this day: gross realism, selfishness, and sensuality. According to Blavatsky, if the root of mankind is one, then there must also be one truth which finds expression in all of the various religions, except the Jewish. The debate around Helena's influence on the Nazis and whether or not she was an anti-Semite have been raging for years, but I think one thing is incredibly clear. Those that like to tout Blavatsky as some sort of progressive are completely whitewashing her anti-Semitic and racist beliefs. People like to think of her as someone that was ahead of her time, but in the secret doctrine, she's essentially promoting her own spiritual version of social Darwinism and racism. And what does Theosophy have to say about inequality and oppression and racism? That it's just part of an evolutionary cycle, part of the plan, if you will. Even the masters that have attained spiritual wisdom, like Kuthomi, are depicted as having servants and contributing to their own forms of inequality. Now, Theosophists will swear blindly that Helena wasn't an anti-Semite or a racist, but I think her words and her legacy speaks for itself. Like, these aren't debatable facts. It's what she wrote in her books. So to argue that she wasn't an anti-Semite is to ignore all of the passages in which she is anti-Semitic over and over again. Now, Henry and Helena had a bit of a falling out when he decided that he wanted to start a Buddhist education fund in Ceylon. He viewed himself as a bit of a saviour, and his idea was that he wanted to help native people get back in touch with Buddhism versus Christianity. Now, she wasn't very happy about this, and Henry received letters from the masters telling him not to do it. But he went ahead and did it anyway, and it was actually a success. And when he finally met back up with Helena, the masters had changed their mind. In late 1882, Helena's health was not doing well. She's a big smoker, she likes to eat, she's been living her life, and she actually got diagnosed with Bright's disease. She helped to establish the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Adjar in 1882. But back in London, things were kicking off. Now, Charles Massey had founded the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society a few years prior in 1877. 1878. And AP Sinnett had recently moved there with his eye on the role of president of the lodge. Now, at the time, Anna Kingsford was the president. And this vying for the top dog role resulted in a split in Theosophy, and AP Sinnett ultimately ended up becoming the president in 1885. But because it's all kicking off, Helena and Henry decide to go to London, and allegedly on an empty train carriage, Henry receives a letter from Koothoomi warning him that there was trouble afoot back in Adjar. See, before him and Helena left, Henry had appointed a board of control, and Emma, you remember Emma, the Cairo clairvoyant with the husband who's on hard times? Well, her and her husband weren't appointed to this board of control. So she's a bit miffed about it. And they went around gossiping about Helena and Theosophy, and they were ultimately asked to leave by one of the members on the board of control, Franz Hartmann. And Franz Hartmann actually offered them a share of a silver mine in Colorado if they'd just piss off. But this silver mine wasn't enough for them, and they demanded cold hard cash, saying that if he didn't give up the goods, they would release letters that showed that Helena was a fraud. Now, Helena got wind of this and she was like, whatever, those letters don't even exist. She wasn't threatened at all. The board eventually ended up levelling their own accusations against Emma and her husband, calling them fraudsters, whatever, and they threw them out. But the shit really hit the fan when the Madras-based Christian College magazine published an article called The Collapse of Koothoomi. Now, according to Emma and her husband, Koothoomi was a cloth dummy that Helena had created, and sometimes Emma's husband would play him in like this weird sort of spiritual cosplay. And Emma claimed that she had letters from Helena admitting the entire ruse, and the Times even ended up picking up the story. Now, understandably, Helena was pissed, and she headed to Cairo with Charles Ledbetter, who was both a paedophile and somebody that was rising within Theosophy at the time. I'll cover the first bit in another video. While they were there, they uncovered a history of fraud by Emma and her husband, allegedly. These people are all dead. I don't know why I said allegedly, like they're going to rise from the grave and like sue me or something. Although maybe they could actually, like in the etheric realm. Who knows? The letters that Emma claimed to have were never made public, and apparently they were later destroyed, so little is known about whether or not they were actually authentic. Helena eventually retreated to write The Secret Doctrine, and she moved to Naples for a while in 1885, but then uprooted to Wurzburg, where she became besties with the Countess Constant Watchmeister. What a name. And she was in Wurzburg when the infamous Hodgson report was released by the Society of Cyclical Research. Richard Hodgson had been investigating Helena in India, and he had been taken in by Emma and her husband's account of fraud. Now, he ended up publishing a report where he called Helena one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting imposters in history, as well as claiming that she was a Russian spy. The shade of it all. However, in the 80s, the Society for Psychical Research denounced the report themselves, with Vernon Harris taking the charge against the Hodgson report, accusing him of bias and dodgy methodology. But Vernon Harris's criticism of the Hodgson report doesn't really tackle whether or not Helena was a fraud or not. It's more kind of criticism of his overall approach. Nevertheless, the report caused a shit ton of trouble inside Theosophy, and Helena wanted to take it to court, but the rest of the Theosophists were like dead against it, and some of them went as far as to denounce her because of this report. So she's got her health deteriorating, people think she's a liar, there's drama all over the place. So she decides to do a little bit of travelling again, and she moves to Ostend in Belgium, where she ends up falling over and gets herself bedridden for 2 months. And at the end of 1886, she claims that the masters informed her that the Theosophical Society was going through its final trial to determine its future, and she was given 2 choices. She either returns to India to die, or she forms a new true school of Theosophy. And in true Helena Blavatsky fashion, she would not go slowly into the night, and she ended up going to London in May of 1887, despite being very unwell. And while she was there, she set up the Blavatsky Lodge as a rival to the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society, which was being run by A.P. Sinnett. The Blavatsky Lodge published a journal called Lucifer, which is a surefire way to grab people's attention in the 1800s. And she also finished working on her longest work yet, which is The Secret Doctrine. And it was so bloody long that regular publishers didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So the Theosophical Society set up their own publishing company, and they published it in 2 volumes. It ended up bringing a lot of new people into Theosophy, including Annie Besant, who had read it when she was assigned to review it. And she was previously an atheist, but upon meeting Blavatsky, she became absolutely smitten with Theosophy, and she grew really close with Helena. In November 1889, Helena met with Gandhi, who later became an associate member of the Blavatsky Lodge, and he remarked that Theosophy is Hinduism in theory, and Hinduism is Theosophy in practice. And hilariously, Helena Blavatsky was implicated in the Jack the Ripper murders by Aleister Crowley after he made this throwaway comment about how the Victorian worthy in the case of Jack the Ripper was no less a person than Helena Blavatsky. In the later part of her life, she wrote 2 more books, The Key to Theosophy and The Voice of Silence. The latter she claimed to have been based on another ancient Censor text called the Book of Golden Precepts. Again, the jury's out on whether or not Censor or any of these ancient texts exist. She ended up moving into Annie Besant's house at 19 Avenue Road in St John's Wood, and this later became known as the European headquarters of the Theosophical Society. The last years of Helena's life were not without controversy, and on the 20th of July 1890, a piece was printed in The Sun titled Blavatsky Unveiled. It was written by Eliot Coues, who had founded his own branch of the Theosophical Society in Washington, D.C. These guys, I swear to God, it's just infighting constantly, all the time. See, he had wanted to take the leadership over from the American arm of the Theosophical Society, which at the time was under the control of William Quan Judge. But when Helena refused to go along with ousting Judge, Eliot was kicked out of the society, and he was a little bit salty about it. In the so-called interview with him in The Sun, it was all the same stories about how Helena is a fraud. He also accused her of having an illegitimate child. Helena, at the end of her life, with nothing left to lose or prove, decided to sue The Sun for libel. But in the winter of 1891, a flu epidemic was raging, and Helena, already in bad health, came down with it in April. On May 7th, 1891, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky rolled her last cigarette, and on May 8th, surrounded by those closest to her, she spoke her final words to Theosophist Isabel Cooper Oakley. She said, Isabel, keep the link unbroken. Do not let my last incarnation be a failure. She was cremated at Woking Crematorium on May 11th, 1891. And on September the 26th, 1892, The Sun printed a retraction of the Blavatsky Unveiled article stating that there was no evidence to back up the claims and that the interview had actually been written by Eliot Coues himself. Helena Blavatsky's legacy is almost as complicated as her life story, and as we'll see going forward in later videos, her ideas can be seen in UFO religions, new religious movements, death cults, and those that believe in certain New Age ideas. I wanted to start with Helena because she's the jumping off point for so much of this. We could start with the Aetherius Society, or Elizabeth Clare Prophet, or Anne Hamilton Byrne, or even Amy Carlson in Love Has Won, but that wouldn't give us the full story. It wouldn't help us to track down the origins of where all of these ideas come from. I've tried to be as impartial as possible when putting this together, but in my opinion, Helena Blavatsky's ideas lay the groundwork for potentially harmful groups to flourish. And indeed, after her death, many did. That is a matter of historical record. Once you know it starts with Blavatsky, it's kind of hard not to see her influence everywhere. And that's not usually a good thing. And you can't whitewash her own words either. As much as people want to put her forward as this woman before her time, her words are very much of her time. steeped in racism, anti-Semitism and ignorance. She also helped to perpetuate harmful ideas about superior races, hypothetical continents, and all manner of things that I would personally file under the spiritual woo-woo category. It's undeniable that Theosophy spawned Ariosophy, and the links between Theosophy's teachings and the rise of fascism are there to see. After her death, Theosophy split into different fractions, and a lot of new people were drawn to Blavatsky's teachings. People like Annie Besant and Charles Ledwether expanded on Blavatsky's original work, forming what would become known as Neo-Theosophy. Indeed, Besant expanded on Blavatsky's ideas of root races, writing in her 1904 book The Pedigree of Man that the Aryans were progressing towards spiritual perfection, while the degraded remnants of obsolete races declined towards a semi-animal state. This in turn inspired people like Alice Bailey, who's widely known as the mother of the New Age, as well as Guy and Edna Ballard, both of which we'll be talking about soon. These were the first offshoot groups from Blavatsky's teachings, and there is her legacy, one that she herself may not approve or agree with. She also inspired people like Erich von Däniken, author of the book Chariots of the Gods, which claims that ancient civilizations were given technology by alien beings. He also claimed to have had access to the Book of Xion, and his book went on to inspire the hit History Channel TV series Ancient Aliens. Helena Blavatsky is undoubtedly one of the most important figures in Western esotericism and the occult, and her life is absolutely fascinating, even if only 5% of it is true. Much like Saint Germain, a name that will appear later down the line, her life has been mythologized and the facts are hard to discern from fiction. Whether or not she was a liar, a fraud, or a narcissist is something that we could debate for days. But the fact of the matter is, her influence was of cosmic proportions. If you have made it this far, then I take my hat off to you. Not literally though, I never take this hat off, but maybe just imagine me doing it. Thank you so much for watching the first installment of this wildly ambitious series in which I try to explain all of these different new religious movements, new agey stuff and cults. I personally thought it was a good idea to start right at the very beginning, and arguably Helena Blavatsky was one of the first. I don't know how long it's going to take me to map out everything, but I cannot wait to do it. So I will see you in the next video. Bye!